Thank you, everybody, and thank you for being here. Marcus, thanks for an amazing conference. It's nice to be last because I can comment on how great everybody's been, and I appreciate you all for still being here. Today we're going to talk about something that I think computational social science has ignored, and I know I certainly did. And the basic idea here is that we draw on a lot of data that come from computational systems that play a role in people's social lives. It's why all these data are interesting to us. So everything from online dating to analyzing the Twitter news feed, we're interested in how people behave using these systems. But one thing that we don't really know very much about is how people think or reason about those systems and whether that affects the way that they use them or not. And so if we're going to make inferences about social science based on these data, it's also important for us to understand how people think about the systems that they're using. It has another part to it too, which I'm going to use as my starting point, which is it also gets to the ethics of doing computational social science. And what I mean here is that we need to understand what people think is going on in these sort of systems in order to not violate expectations. As Maria pointed out, it's all about expectations when we're trying to think about doing ethical work at scale with computational social science. So let me start off with a study that I did with Facebook. Had a huge worldwide negative reaction to this paper. Very interesting experience to spend a month reading emails from around the world about how horrible a person you are. I've recovered. My psychologist tells me I'm doing okay. Most of you are familiar with this. Basic idea is Facebook manipulated people's news feeds to examine how the absence of emotions in the news feed could change the way they ended up producing emotional posts, to look at whether emotions spread through a network in a contagious type way, so you feel happier when you see your friends happy, or in a social comparison sort of framework, which is when I see my friends being happy, it makes me sad. The paper concludes that it's more of a contagious type model. But what I'm going to talk about today is how we violated basically people's expectations. And one of the reasons for that is we didn't have a good idea about how people think about something like the news feed. Okay? And one of the unique things about being part of this project is that I received a lot of mail. Let's call it what it was, hate mail. And I received almost 1,000 emails. And I wanted to know more, so like a good social scientist, I've analyzed those emails. And what I want to do is try to say, like, what were users trying to tell me? So there were a lot of academics wrote me. I'm going to set them aside. Lawyers, politicians, they wrote as well, but I'm going to set them aside. And I'm going to show you the results of a sort of content analysis of the remaining emails, which were the users, okay? And the number one theme of all the emails that I received were usually involved more swear words, but how dare you manipulate my newsfeed? Okay, and this is very common. People were like, how dare you interfere with my newsfeed? Like, to them, the newsfeed was like a social window, right? A window into their world. And this idea that the newsfeed could be manipulated was just completely unfathomable to them, or just made no sense. And of course, Facebook played a role in this. Facebook, for a long time, it had stopped by the time the study came out, was calling itself a platform. And platforms don't manipulate people, right? Neither do Windows. Okay. Another one that came out was how important the newsfeed is in a lot of people's lives. So this is an example. My friend's dad just passed away. If I was in this experiment, I'd never have known, right? And so they were very upset that something that's deeply important to them was being manipulated. And this goes against a lot of what I think the popular press calls social media, which is sort of trivial and meaningless. My experience from these emails is that that's definitely not the case. Okay, so the news feed and other feeds like them are quite important. A third was that emotions are distinctly important. I think here's where we violated some sense of autonomy. People wrote frequently about, like, hey, these are my emotions, this is my mind, this is me, you can't mess with that. And the last is sort of like a paradox of doing big data research. So I've done a lot of studies, many of them get presented in the media. I'd never had these kind of questions. I want to know if I was in your experiment. Because it was large enough that, potentially could have been in that. Whereas most of our work in psychology and in communication, they've been done at a university, so some students, like on a campus, it happened to them. and I can learn from that. But here, we're potentially learning from something that I was in. So big data is sort of paradoxically personal, potentially personal. So this is the users, and as I said, the really big theme that came through was that first one about being manipulated. And so I was curious, is this just for the users? No, we looked at the media. We could take all of the articles over the 6 months after the controversy came out and say, okay, it's about a Facebook research study, and it's either our study or some other study, and we can compare the language of them. And we looked at a couple of things that tell us about whether surprise is being experienced. This is a very simple sort of summary of the data, but basically you can see that when journalists were writing about the article, about this study, they used more first-person singular than they were writing about other Facebook studies, and they used more anxiety terms as well. And this is consistent with linguistic expressions of surprise. We can look at the academy. So how did other scholars write about it? So we looked at about 6 months after. There were about 120 citations. And we can see even academics are using more first-person singular in the abstracts and more anxiety terms. So this is looking at people that cited the Facebook study and either were writing about ethical aspects or the scientific aspects. And they were about half and half. And you can see that even academics were expressing some linguistic surprise. So to me, that means that we violated a lot of expectations. I mean, I think there's many reasons why this study became controversial, and probably if we ran the simulation of life again, 1,000 times, only some percentage of them would it have been controversial, and some other study would have received all that attention. But clearly in our case, we violated people's expectations. Other issues, of course, were people being completely unaware of the algorithmic aspects of the feed. Informed consent was a really big issue, and happy to talk with people offline about that issue, and that it was personal. But really looking across all these different sort of reactions to the study, it's about expectation violation. Okay? And this got us sort of thinking about how do people think about these systems. And there's a really great literature in children development, cognition, anthropology, referring to folk theories. And this is what we've been thinking about a lot. Folk theories are basically how we think about complex systems. We tend to be unaware of how we think about them, so they're sort of intuitive and implicit. We don't really explicitly think about them, and they're intuitive. So Matt and I yesterday were talking about our kids and how dumb they are when they're first born, and they sort of like develop some folk theories as the time goes on. So they'll initially walk right off a stage or walk into a deep pool of water, because they have no concept that there's gravity, right? Over time, their understanding of gravity evolves to the point where recently my 6-year-old daughter asked me how gravity works. I was like, yeah, this is going to be great. Got to tell my daughter how gravity works, and it went horrible. She asked how gravity works. I'm like, well, there's big things, and they have mass, and they attract smaller things to them. And she's like, okay, great. Why? And you know where this goes. After about 3 whys, I was in deep trouble. And it turns out that if I asked anybody in here, including the physicist that talked about it earlier, or mentioned he was a physicist, after about 5 or 6 whys, most people don't know how gravity actually works and would have a difficult time describing, what the gravitational coefficient is, et cetera, et cetera. Yet, all of us are here and alive today, right? So we actually have a very good understanding for our current purposes of how gravity works. That is, we have a folk theory of how gravity works. So when we think about computational systems, we see something that's similarly complex. Take the Facebook newsfeed as the example. It's not only massively engineered to the point where most people can't understand how a system like that works. Massive amounts of data, really advanced machine learning, but also it's being plugged into a massive social system. It receives billions of social inputs on a daily basis. So it's incredibly complex, and people, we argue, must have some sort of folk theory as they engage with it, much like they have a folk theory about, say, gravity or toilets or zippers, all of which, by the way, we have folk theories for, and most people perform really poorly at saying how exactly a toilet works. So the point there is not that we're dumb. In fact, we're not. We just use it really well enough for what we need to do. Toilets just take care of business. And we don't have to go into depth for it, right? So that's the key thing here. Folk theories are not about people being dumb. It's about them having a good enough understanding for what they want to accomplish. Our argument is that we just have no idea what people think about when they interact through systems with other people. And there's tons of these kind of systems now, not only Facebook and Twitter, but online dating, Uber. Vast numbers of systems play a role in our social lives now. And so what is it that people think goes on in that black box, which is itself sort of a folk theory, right? A metaphor, that allows them to understand how the social behaviors of others are seen and how their social behavior may be seen by others. So to look at this, we wanted to come up with a method to develop this. And a couple of colleagues have developed their own ways, primarily through interviewing people and asking them and trying to surface these folk theories. And we wanted to come up with another method that allowed us to look at many, many more people. So for example, some colleagues at Illinois did a really nice study with 40 people doing interviews and came up with these really fascinating theories about how people think that it works. And the vast majority of those people at the beginning of the study had no idea that there was any algorithm involved, right? Which gets to this sort of expectation idea. For us, we're gonna take a different approach. We're gonna use metaphors. And metaphors are really useful because they allow us to sort of tap into unspoken ideas that people have by allowing them to just use a metaphor that captures some of the qualities of what their folk theory is without having to, explicitly articulate it. And so here we have previous work out of cognition that says metaphors are a good way of getting these folk theories. Metaphors are really common in tech, so to pitch your company, you think of another company that's similar to, so like Pi is the Uber for pizza delivery, Bannerman is the Uber for security, LawTrades is the Uber for lawyers. Metaphors are really good for helping other people understand what it is at the core of what you're trying to do or say. So here's our method. It's this idea. I'm going to try and show you the method, sort of the overall method here, and then some of the conclusions that we find for the method. Essentially, for this non-representative but large sample, we find that there are 4 underlying folk theories that describe most people's understanding of social feeds, with Facebook and Twitter having really similar underlying folk theories. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is discover the metaphors that people hold for these different kinds of systems. Then we're going to try and reduce that metaphor space down into some factors, using factor analysis to say these are potential candidate factors. And then look at the qualities of those factors to understand what they are. And we're going to use semantic differentials to get at that sort of quality aspect. So the first thing is figuring out how to get people's metaphors. Typical ways of surveying people, we need to know what all the metaphors are and ask people if they agree with it. We wanted to come up with a way that users could tell us what they think. And we used a wiki survey developed by Matt Salganic and Karen Levy. It's really cool. Here's an example of what a user from MTurk would have seen. Which metaphor best captures your understanding of how the Facebook newsfeed selects your content? And then they would read them and they could choose one or the other. But if neither of those really worked for it, they could add their own metaphor, okay? So they type that in. That metaphor now becomes part of the database, and that metaphor will ultimately be seen by later users and will enter the sort of pairwise dogfight that all the metaphors go through. And so we see all these pairwise battles take place, and then we can calculate what metaphors are the most powerful. What's the ones that people agree with the most? Here's the top 10 metaphors for the 2 social feeds, Facebook and Twitter. The ones that have asterisks by them are ones that were generated by users. So most of the ones, 7 out of 10 for both of the systems, are metaphors generated by our users and not by the research team. So that's really cool. You can take a look at some examples like magazine, network TV, newspaper. They kind of have this old media sort of style to them. There's a number of metaphors that are similar to being an assistant. So we can see that there's some themes there. And what we want to do is take all the top metaphors and see if we can factor analyze them into some smaller subset of metaphors. And to do this, we just asked a bunch of other people to say how much they agreed with various kind of statements like newsfeed is like a magazine. You either really don't think that or you really do. And you can ask that for every single metaphor. Once we have that, we can factor analyze all the metaphors we received into some core number of potential folk theories. For Facebook, they factor analyze down to about 4. You can see how they group together here. One is about like personal shopper, butler, bouncer, with some other kind of weirder ones like coin sorter, decision tree. Number 2 is like those old media type things. 3 is sort of like difficult to understand type metaphors. And 4 is like got this negative spying type sense to it. And for Twitter, we see 4 factors as well. And you've got kind of a salad, decision tree, flower picking. It's a little bit difficult to make sense of what's going on there. Another one's very mechanistic. This one here also mechanistic, and then this is this sort of like maybe other people helping or not. But it's difficult for us to make sense. So what we want to look at is what are the qualities people associate with these kinds of metaphors. So to do that, we use semantic differentials. And we can basically say, for people that hold this sort of any of these metaphors as the most common thing for Facebook, we can ask all these questions like, well, how do you feel about it? Is this a good thing if this is what the news feed is like? Is this good? And we can use a bunch of these. So we have, for example, do you think the news feed or you think Twitter's feed is useless or useful? Shows me a wide or limited variety of content. Does it depend on what I do, or is independent of my behavior? How transparent is it? Can I tell like how easily it works? And whose interests are prioritized, mine or other people's or the company's? So the basic idea here is we can say, here's the kind of metaphors you think a news feed or a social feed is like. And then we can ask them, what do you think of the Facebook news feed? And that allows us to understand what the kind of qualities of that factor are. We find, again, that the Twitter and the Facebook factors are really similar. In fact, I'm going to argue today that there's 4 sort of folk theories for social feeds, and we see them in both Twitter and Facebook. The first one we're going to call the rational assistant. The rational assistant had metaphors like, personal assistant as an example, or personal shopper. And it had a very positive evaluation, so people really liked the feed. And they also did not think it prioritized the company. They thought it prioritized them. So this is a really great, if you work at Facebook or Twitter and you find out that people have this sort of folk theory, this is great. This is the kind of folk theory you would imagine you'd want those companies to, their users to have. In contrast, there's a more neutral version. So these are people that, they had a positive evaluation towards the system. They didn't know it was curated at all. And they thought it was quite transparent. These are the people that were really like shocked when they learned, for example, that the newsfeed is manipulated. So this is very neutral in terms of what they think the system's doing, but it's quite a positive folk theory. Then we have what we call the unwanted observer. So these people have a very negative view of the social feeds. They think that it's prioritizing the company. The kind of metaphors we saw here were things like spy and paparazzi. This is a very negative folk theory for how social feeds work. The last one we call the corporate black box. So basically, I don't know how it works, but I think Facebook and Twitter, it's all about them. It's not about me. So it's corporate, and I'm unsure of how it works. So we see these 4, and they appear to be similar across the 2 social feeds. Okay. What we can ask then is, well, how do these feeds stack up on the 2? So you can have stronger or weaker beliefs about each system and how strongly you hold the folk theory for each system. So we can then look at how people hold different folk theories for each system. So this is kind of like the average strength of how much you agree with a particular folk theory for the 2. Facebook's in black, Twitter is in the gray, and you can see that Twitter outscores Facebook on rational assistant and the transparent platform. And if you're Twitter, this is really good news. Those are pretty positive views. Those are a positive folk theory for a system. Whereas Facebook, the unwanted observer and corporate black box are held more strongly for the Facebook news feed than for Twitter. And this perhaps isn't that surprising. First of all, Facebook, the news feed is much more algorithmically curated than Twitter, although Twitter is as well. But one of the reasons that we use this term folk theory is that we can get outside of just like how it works. That's more a mental model, right? And mental model is like, what do I do and what comes out? Folk theory allows for a much broader understanding. So it's what I think, if Marcus tells me that he really hates, the Facebook thing and that they're stealing things, or if I hear in the news media that, Facebook has created some sort of scandal, all of those inputs for me, whether it's from interpersonal, my own experience with it, or cultural, like the media, they can all influence how I think about this system. And so we see here that Facebook tends to have these more negative kind of folk theories held for it more strongly than the others. Okay, so now that we've developed this method, there's a whole bunch of questions that we can start to ask. I'll just lay out through them real quickly here. So depending on what kind of folk theory you have, does this predict your behavior? And according to folk theories, the literature, it should very much drive behavior. So the way we think about a system, this folk theory, should predict how we treat it, how we interact with it. So if you have a personal shopper folk theory, you should be interacting a lot with the system. The more you give that system, the better it's going to be for you, the more stuff it's going to bring to you, for example. If you have the unwanted observer folk theory, you're going to be a lot more hesitant because it's not doing stuff for you, right? It's taking from you and using it for somebody else. What experiences prompt updates to a folk theory? So if you learned that Facebook manipulated your newsfeed and that violates your expectations of what the newsfeed is, then how does that update? What updating takes place for folk theories? And I think that's continuously being updated as you experience it, interact with it, and hear about it through the media. And then how are folk theories stable across types of algorithms and over time? So do we see similar kinds of folk theories for other systems like online dating? I can tell you already the answer is no. People have very different folk theories for how online dating systems work. What about Siri or OK Google or Alexa? What are our folk theories for what those, super complex engineered things are that we're having social interactions with? We don't know yet. Okay, so I think there's this whole world of trying to understand essentially the psychology of algorithms, but I think algorithms are too narrow. It's about these systems that we use to conduct our social lives with. And I'm working with my student, Megan French, who's on the market this year and is absolutely fantastic, and Mike DeVito and Jeremy Bernholtz at Northwestern to keep working on this project, and this is joint work with all of them. And I thank you all very much for your continued attention all the way through the end of the conference, and thank you very much. Appreciate it.